All right, good afternoon, morning, actually. Thank you all for coming to the service provider panel, one of them anyway. My name's Tom Nadeau. I'm from Brocade, and I'll be moderating. Although I think we won't have any fist fights up here today with these guys. Got our esteemed panel of folks from various service providers, and then Doug is also from basically an end user, deployment kind of perspective. So that should be some additional interesting insight. So why don't you guys introduce yourselves? Start with Brian. Yeah, go right to left, and get to know these guys.
Good morning, folks. Brian Freeman from AT&T. DMTS, working on SDN controllers, lead of our architecture. And if you saw the slides you liked from Chris Rice's talk this morning, those were my slides. The ones you didn't like, those were somebody else's. I don't know where they came from, but happy to talk to you about service operator views of ODL.
Hey, I'm Chris Luke from Comcast in the network architecture organization, although on this panel I'm here kind of mostly as an advisory group chair hat, partly because my colleague down the road is also from Comcast. But I'll be floating around. You'll see me on the advisory group panel tomorrow.
Doug Marschke at SDN Essentials. I'm a little bit different from the rest of the panel members up here. As Tom said, our company is actually a provider of services, so we do a lot of professional services and training. So we're the ones that are doing the implementation, the migration work, and taking the phone calls when people are mad. So I think I'll have some interesting, maybe a different insight compared to some of the other carriers up here.
Thanks, Doug. Hi, my name is Samir Patel. Again, as Chris mentioned, I'm from Comcast, work out of Internet Services team, and I'm working on next-gen PCMM project that Neil just shared this morning. That's
cool. So I want to keep it interactive, so we don't. I'm not going to run around with microphones or anything, but if you do have a question or comment, or you feel offended by what anybody says up here, feel free to stand up and just shout loud, and I'll repeat your question if we need to.
Or throw fruit.
Or throw fruit. All right, so let's start stuff off. I've got a whole host of questions, and by the way, and if you all have questions, please stand up and throw them out here. So let's start off with just kind of a general question: is ODL suitable for use in production environments? And sort of obviously, like Chris's presentation just now showed that it is, like for AT&T, for example, but it's interesting to hear from the other folks. And then I'm sure Brian and maybe Margaret, who's here, have feedback about what. No, obviously, but you have operational experience with this.
We have a spare chair.
So just to get kind of your feedback on like what's missing, right? Like what do we need to do to make this thing better for the next year?
Well, I'll go first if that's okay. So we are in production, been in production for a while. A couple of things that we're doing to be cautious about our production deployments. One is we're separating by application our instances. So we have multiple disjoint, separated installations of OpenDaylight because we're not quite sure, at what point MDSAL, what its performance limits are, all that kind of stuff. We're also investing in geo redundancy, so that's a growth area for ODL to do that better. Make it more seamless, make it easier on the operators to be able to handle the geo redundancy without all the extra bells and whistles that we're having to add right now. Also, just plain upgrades. At scale, you have a running instance, you've got customer data, you're processing transactions. During a maintenance interval, we need to move from beryllium to boron. And right now, that means dump all the data and then re-import all the data. We need a whole lot better ways of doing those kinds of things. In-place upgrades of the Yang data models, which we've talked about before. All those kinds of things are needed. and we could keep going on. But just to make it more like you were running an OLTP system, rock solid with upgrade tools, admin tools, schema management tools, et cetera, are all needed to be able to scale.
So should the upstream community build those things, or should other distros build those things, or
I think it's
or
better for-
companies like Doug's?
Well, I'll let other people talk. I think this is something upstream should help with, right? I hold the distribution partner responsible because we use a distribution from a well-known vendor. But I hold them responsible because I call them at 2 in the morning. I think it's in everybody's best interest to have these in the upstream, though, because every user is going to need to be able to have those migration tools, the data management tools, et cetera, et cetera.
So I think that feedback is very important, because there was a specific conversation about the upgrade, for example, with in the community, and the sort of majority of developers kind of voted against it. And so I think it's important. One of the things these forums are important for, like the user panel, is to give this feedback back to the community to say, hey, thanks, but we need something else here,
And I think,
Yeah,
I was going to
there
pick
was
up on
an
that.
explicit conversation about this, and the developers said, we're not interested in supporting upgrades.
And
Many of the developers.
that's the first I heard of that vote, and I'm really surprised that didn't go through the advisory group, which
It
is
was kind of,
very
it was kind of
disappointing.
a little before the advisory group was
Oh, so
really
that was over a year ago.
booted up. Yeah, it was about a year
okay.
ago.
Okay.
And I remember, because, like, my dev team was part of the conversation, and we were okay with it, but no one else wanted to do it, so what are you going to do,
I think, echoing what Brian was saying, the feedback that I've seen from many of the advisory group members is that, yes, there's a lot of OpenDaylight that is absolutely suitable for production, but that degree is uneven across the various components of it. And you do need to do a bit of research into the background of the specific features you're trying to use to see how mature it is and whether it's suitable for production in your environment. And that's not a small piece of work.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point. I mean, that's kind of the struggle with making a distro, and there's a bunch of them around, but like what level of stability are you interested in, and I think the answer is different for everybody almost. I mean, there's a core of things, right?
It's not what you're interested in, is for your application, can you engineer around the stability that exists?
Yeah.
Right, because I think if you ask any service provider, they would say, 0 packet loss and no downtime, that's an okay requirement to meet, right?
But
But when you know that it doesn't, then you have to engineer around it. You have to have, a BGP session from every node in the cluster, because if one node goes down, the next can pick it up, the other can pick it up. So you engineer around it, and you add more cost and complexity, but you live with what's there in order to get the features into the marketplace, right?
cool. Yeah, and I think there are examples of that are interesting, right? Like remember with clustering early on, right? And clustering has come a long way in the last 2 years, right? And initially, I know certain people had to do workarounds to, just to facilitate that. But what's interesting here is the community actually fixed that stuff, right? Whereas if you're trying to work with a regular vendor on a proprietary thing, they'd fix it for you, but 3 years from now, right? And that's also an interesting sort of tidbit in here to point out. But do you guys have other comments around that?
You guys are all very nice. So
I'm sure you have a
I'm
comment
gonna
about backup.
Trumpify this a little bit and make it a little more exciting, because people are kind of getting sleepy out there.
You're going to make it great again.
It's nice if you to answer your question. Is it deployable? It's nice if you work for AT&T or Comcast or a big carrier when you have hundreds, sometimes thousands of people working on this. Most of our customers aren't that. They're enterprises or smaller rural ISPs. It's actually difficult. I'll be the one that says it. We have a pretty good business model helping them out, but
So why is it difficult? Like, do you have
because
example, maybe?
there's kind of a few. One is really just technical expertise. As everyone up here has been working on ODL for years. We can get into MD solve stuff later, but that's not the easiest thing to deal with. It's an improvement from what was there in the first rev for sure, but it's still not easy. And it's been a problem for our customer space. We do a lot of different POCs and evals for a lot of different controllers, and They have to really balance if they're going to spend the money on us. Are they going to let us do all that work for them?
Or internal dev.
Or internal, which is
whatever, yeah.
almost impossible because they can't hire the people. They don't exist.
Yep.
All unicorns are, taken up by Brocade or AT&T. You guys find the unicorns faster than, some of these tier 2,
I mean,
tier 3
we've had that
ISPs can.
issue, like our specific customers have had that sort of thing, right? And that's the debate you have to have internally, right? Is, how much can you afford to put into this, or you outsource it?
Right.
So you mentioned like specific components that you've had issues with. Can you give examples? You said MDSAL, but do you like specifically what?
Well, for us, again, we're playing in a lot of the space where there's an engineer or two trying to do innovation at their company, and maybe they've already put in some dev time. Maybe that was in a different controller. I don't know, Ryu, name your controller, and it's been very difficult to port what they've already done over to OpenDaylight. There's no.
So why is that? Is it because it's old? It's out of sync, or is it too customized, or what?
It's not out of sync. It's just different from the other controllers they worked on, right? It's different APIs. It's different code, right? A lot of people when they're first learning, we do a lot of education, so we use Floodlight and Ryu for a lot of our courses. It's really easy to program on those, using Python and such.
But it doesn't do a whole lot.
Doesn't do a whole lot, right?
Yeah.
But
So maybe that's
when you're tier
key.
3, maybe it does a whole lot. Like that's a happy moment for them. If you're AT&T, it doesn't do a whole lot. But they're like, okay, great, let's take what we already have and now move it to OpenDaylight. And then they realize you can't. You have to basically start from scratch. So,
But isn't that because of?
So just
Go
to
ahead.
clarify, are you usually working with the upstream and just trying to get your customers working with some version of the upstream, or is it a supported distro?
Can you repeat the question for?
Sure. The question was, are you working with the upstream with your customers, or is it a supported distro? Usually not with the upstream. They don't really even know what that means yet. A lot of these smaller providers aren't going upstream because they're just initially starting. So, companies like InnoCyber, or they're a partner of ours, so we'll interface with them from time to time, but Brocade as well, honestly. We need the vendor support for us and for our customers because they can't do it alone, so it is creating an ecosystem. So whichever relationship they have currently within their own network, maybe they're a Cisco shop, maybe they're a Brocade shop, maybe they're a Juniper shop, that's kind of the place we start, and then we start looking at the ODL community. I don't know if that answers your question. But.
It brings up another aspect of scale. If you go to my talk, that's not a plug, but we think it's dangerous to have everybody try and learn MDSAL, okay? Because it takes too long, and there's some expertise you need that distracts from the application designer doing their thing. So we kind of have a common platform that we use, but we do find it takes about 6 months before someone who has been exposed to MDSAL core Java code to write good applications. And I have like a 9-module course that about 200 people in the company have taken to get used to the environment, et cetera. But it takes, we knew to expand the number of, people who are doing training and getting exposure to how this controller environment is different than an ONOS or a Floodlight or a Contrail or what, because they're all different paradigms on how they do stuff.
So do you
we need
think
to scale that training as well.
Well, so do you think we need a different development model for users? For example, one of the things we do with some of our customers is promote coding to the RESTconf API only.
But there's a big performance hit when you use RESTconf, and what we're starting to see is some of the newer applications, we have to go direct to Java.
So, but could we use a different interface and make, to solve
We're
that?
open to new interfaces, for sure. Yeah.
Because what you guys are referring to here, these sort of complaints about the high cliff to climb to get into this this has existed since the day we started this thing, right? And it's gotten better, right? It doesn't take a year now to figure the thing out, but it's 6 months is still
Well, but that's to write good MD-SAL-oriented code, that's what it takes.
That's
Because,
still
you
pretty
spend the
heavy duty.
first month just trying to figure out how to install and configure and
Right, right.
all that
You
good
spend the
stuff.
first month trying to work
Right.
out where the files are.
Yeah, et cetera. But the people that do our MD-SAL coding, they're now past that, right? But we see that we need to expand that because there's some things we use RESTComp for right now that, you get a certain level of performance and it's easy to learn. You can use Postman to make sure that you got it right, and that's good. And then you get to the point, well, okay, now I want to take that up an order of magnitude in performance.
Yeah.
And okay, now I have to, same data didn't change, but now it's a totally different approach to how I'm going to interact with MD-SAL at a good granularity. But now you got to be careful. You got to do, you got to do the locking, all that good stuff that you didn't have to worry about on the RESTComp side. So.
Yeah, I mean,
it's an expansion.
there have been some attempts to overcome that. For example, there were some bus options, right? Various buses now. A lot of the distros or the third parties now have their own bus thing to hook up to it, whatever. One of the popular ones. Is that
But
better?
it's not complete. Like for us, we have the equivalent of Kafka, but we turn that into REST.
Yeah.
Right, because there's not a direct way to launch Yang RPCs off of the Kafka bus.
So you really want like a straight up, high performance path, which is basically avoids, REST.
Yeah, when
Just
we
goes in
when we
directly.
need to do it high performance, willing to take the climb the cliff approach and do it in Java. There's a lot of things we can get done with straight REST, and it's good, works fine. Lasts a long time. But other things, when you need that extra performance, you're gonna have to do directly in Java.
Chris,
Yeah.
Samir, do you guys have?
Yeah, so for us, we are just currently going through this operational model, right, where we just finished the product. So I would certainly second that to Brian because that's the exact experience that we have gone through. And it definitely takes 6 months or so to get up to the speed with MD-SAL by the time you download it and so forth. So I would say it doesn't matter whether it's a big ISP versus small. HA, high availability, is definitely an issue, to dismantle that. And that's what we are currently going through. However, we stumbled upon AMQP, Active Messaging Queue Protocol.
Yep.
So to begin with, to your point, Tom, we are adding that rather than decoupling MD-SAL and that layer. So hopefully that would solve the problem.
Cool. But, if you guys have questions, comments, just raise your hand or yell out. I mean, is anybody else thinking about this sort of stuff out here? Performance impacts or anything like that?
This is stream API, right, for notifications. We were having some
RESTConf notifications, yep.
in terms of a cluster, when a failover happens, that subscription by the northbound client seems to be disrupted after that.
Yes, yeah.
And we are now thinking, how can we make that recover without the client having to resubscribe?
Yep. So there are deployment strategies, maybe you guys can
Yeah, first off.
talk about that.
Every single component in ODL needs to be cluster aware, and they are not all today.
Not yet.
Okay,
Yep.
for exactly what you're seeing. And that drives us crazy when we know that component A actually handles clustering really well, and then when the shard leader shifts, they reinitiate their southbound sessions and goodness occurs. And then a matching component says, no, don't turn on clustering. I've not finished all my development, or I know there's performance issues or whatever. And so it's very uneven, and there's a lot of the headaches of what we have to go through as service providers. On the northbound notifications in particular, we're very hesitant about using the web notifications that way. We are syncing the netconf notifications, and then we will spin out, either publish on Kafka or whatever, our own publish of that. We're not depending on that web services notification for very much because it's of these kinds of issues that are popped up. It's kind of a neat thing, but we're a little hesitant about it. So that's what we find. We have to always test and debug first, and then decide what the implementation is going to be, based on what the code really does. Right? Yep. Things to add?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, Brian. So for us, it's the same thing. We are taking exact same approach. So we are building internal tool to address that part. Yep.
And there are other things too. I mean, you could, like, for example, put a web load balancer in front of the cluster itself, so that and you obviously have to have some sort of notification that the node is dead or not. But then you can sort of balance, and so the apps on top won't know that there's a difference. That's another thing you could do too, right?
One thing with this subscription is it's bound to IP address today.
Right, so the IP address would be of the load balancer, not of the cluster itself. Yeah, that's how you can get around that too.
But then you need to write an app that is shard leader aware.
Yes.
And so it wasn't until I think the last release
It's the
that
last one we added.
we had added the capability to find out who the shard leader was from within ODL. You can do it via JMX maybe if you parse stuff, but now you can actually write apps that say, look, I'm not the shard leader, I'm not going to run, or I am the shard leader, I will do the transaction, et cetera. So.
Yep. Cool. Anyone else? Any other pieces of feedback? No? So let's move on to some other sort of specific questions we had in here. So we talked about upgrade, path complexity. How about in terms of we were just kind of touching on this, like every ODL distribution out there, and every customer that I've talked to does not want to use the package sort of straight out of the box. There's a lot of customization that needs to happen. Are there any is there any feedback you have on customization, but then do you also have any recommendations for things that we could make better for, in the customization bucket? We talked about RESTconf or bus additions, right? But like the way you guys plug into the OSS and that sort of thing. I mean, that's usually where most of the work actually is, right?
Right.
It's
So
that.
one recommendation I would say is, as you said, once we get that release, there are a lot of dependencies and gets the packages from online. So it's very important for us to have that particular box have an internet connection. So usually in our world we stay green, right? Green network zone. So as a result of that, we don't have that internet connection. So that's what I would recommend. First thing to do is make sure you get those packages locally, so that you can avoid those
The
things.
standalone.
Standalone.
Yeah, cached version build.
Exactly.
Yep. Cool. So anything else around that? I mean, there's a lot, like Doug, I mean, that's a lot of what you guys do, right? I mean, you install the thing, but there's stuff around the edges that you've got to, you know what I mean? The cement that glues the controller to the northbound stuff and the southbound stuff.
Yeah,
right?
I'm probably not the best. I'm not a programmer, so I'm probably not the best person to talk in individual modules. But again, I think our customer base is a little bit different, and the full package is a pretty heavy package. So I think we saw the keynote with Ericsson. The first thing they did with hydrogen was pull off and rewrite and update, and we see quite a bit of that as well. Although, as you said, every release is getting better and better, right? But I think it's the thing about ODL that when you're a first-time user and you start installing the packages, you find out how much there is in there and how daunting that actually can be.
Yep.
It's like, well, what do I use? There's 7 different ways to do this. What's the best way? And for us, that's kind of one of our first tasks when we start working with different clients is, we talk about use cases all the time, but narrow down the use cases and figuring out what the heck we actually need in packages. And there is always some customization, and it's mostly what you guys mentioned, going to the OSS side or the billing side. That's where most of our programming efforts actually go into. And
Yeah, that's very common.
and there's not really, there's not too much commonality that everyone kind of has their own system, and
But could we add things, right? So could we add, we've kind of tossed around some of the things that could be used. We talked about message bus in general. We talked about improving RESTconf, things like that. I mean, is there anything in Carafe that we can help? I mean, one example of what you just described, it was very hard, is if you look at Honeycomb, right? If you talk to Ed, Ed spent, 4 or 5 hours figuring out the dependencies and unwinding things enough to build this, Chris, you're using this, right? I mean, Honeycomb is sort of like this minimal set of the controller. In fact, it doesn't even have carafe either, right?
No, I mean, what they've done is they've stripped it down. They've taken, there's like 4 or 5 core components of OpenDaylight. They're
Yep.
using 3 of them.
Yep.
It's basically the netconf northbound, the rest conf, some of the stuff in the middle, nothing else.
Yep.
The whole job processing scheduler inside, that's gone. And the idea is to get down to a really, really tiny footprint, but using those key parts from OpenDaylight because they're tested, proven,
Right.
and known to work.
So maybe one of the things is sort of less dependencies, or the minimal,
Oh, in general, I mean,
try to reduce the
anybody who's
dependencies.
watched the release process for OpenDaylight knows that dependencies are often the big issue.
Right, yeah, getting it just to build completely. Cool. What else did I have in here? So, we've been talking about some of the kind of major components. I mean, do you guys have concerns over what, the state of some of the core components, for example? I mean, we just had a keynote where they said, Tony has left the project. Tony has written half the code in the core. Do you guys have any concerns for that? Do you have thoughts about how to mitigate that, make you feel better about that sort of thing? I mean, beyond you guys starting to write code, right?
The answer's going to be yes. But my concern is, if you step back for a second, we think it's just healthy to always have 2 committers from different companies for every module. It doesn't matter what the open source project is. If you look across many of the most important components in ODL, we don't quite have 2 companies that have the committers. Clearly, a lot of the thought leadership is from a small group who are doing a fantastic job, but there's some concern, some risk, and you'd want to see more committers on the major modules from different companies.
And more diversity of committers in the major modules.
And more diversity. Carriers, to the extent they can, are contributing source back in, but we're also working through vendors, through distribution partners, et cetera, to get source back in. But we're spending a lot of time at the applications. We don't use source code, ODL source that hasn't come from a distribution partner, but we have contributed, patches and fixes back into the main line that we then beat on our distribution partner to get back to us,
Right.
very quickly. But it is a concern, but the community needs to work on that.
Yeah, because I mean, if you look at, 3 out of the 4 core projects, most of the committers are from one company.
Yeah, and there's definitely this coalescing that each company seems to focus on the features that they think are their feature rather than mixing around a bit.
Yeah.
I think the thing that highlighted ahead of this release was, I think it was maybe a month or 2 before the release candidates were being cut, the 2 people that had worked on the new OpenFlow module quit
They just
and moved on.
Yeah, exactly.
Done. And so there was a big question about whether that module would make it into the release, bearing in mind a lot of the rest of OpenDaylight had been refactored around it.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So that's something, I really wanted to get, you guys to talk about, because it's an underlying issue, and it's sort of it's a catch-22, right? Working on the core is not the sexy stuff you can, talk about my great application, right? I mean, you're talking about the innards of this thing, like you're saying, you don't really worry about
We
it.
should have a Hug the Core Developer Day or something.
Yeah,
Service providers value, love, embrace the people working on the plumbing and the core capabilities. MDSAL, base controller, netconf, because it's just core to everything inside ODL.
Yang tool.
Yang tools that every one of us uses every day. So, they don't get enough credit for all the great things that have happened, and they are core to the success of OpenDaylight. If MDSAL is not rock solid, service providers will move on to other controllers.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right? We can buy adapters. It's the core.
It's the core.
Yang tools and MDSAL is the thing that is a differentiator.
Yep.
If you need a model-driven controller that's programmable, you're on OpenDaylight because of Yang tools and MDSAL. Right? They have to be rock solid. Hug a core developer.
Hug a core developer today. Yeah.
So I'm curious if you're using OpenDaylight in conjunction with OpenStack, and how do you see that integration? Are there areas for improvement there?
We are using it in combination with OpenStack. I suspect most people are.
We're thinking about
You're
it.
thinking about it
At least in a lab
in
somewhere.
a lab.
I try not to think about OpenStack.
It's hard to get your
You
hands
live in a
around.
nice world. But we're an owner-operator, as Mr. Donovan has said, for cloud. So we have run many OpenStack cloud instances. We've integrated through Neutron ML2. I'll put in a plug for Gluon. We think that's part of the natural evolution to
Yep.
allow multiple controllers
Agree entirely.
to tie into OpenStack. Because there will be situations where you have multiple controllers in carrier networks, right? The only one we currently don't have, by the way, is Ryu. We are heavily involved in OpenStack and see that for virtualization as a key technology for us to not only run the business, but for others, to kind of grow in the industry in this space, right?
Yeah, I think that Toby's talk yesterday. was
Toby's talk
about
yesterday,
that. Yeah.
his work in OpenStack, et cetera.
Doug.
No, I think you actually said a lot. I was going to say right there, but I think I guess like a confusing part about this whole SDN movement and these word opens, they all kind of get combined together, right? It's like the Lucky Charms with the nice little marshmallows. It's all in the same bowl of cereal. It again, going back to use cases, is very use case driven. I think OpenDaylight and OpenStack actually play pretty nice together, considering some of the other options out there. The other thing that you mentioned, which is really starting to become very important for our customers, is how you use OpenDaylight and how it interfaces with other controllers. I think it's somewhat obvious now to most people that a lot of the larger deployments you're doing aren't going to be just based on OpenDaylight. You might have an overlay controller in there. Pick your overlay vendor. You might have a different controller using
Or something underneath.
right, or something
There's an
underneath,
adapter
right?
underneath, yeah.
You might be doing something different in the core edge, something different in the data center, and that's really the next piece to try to solve.
So
it.
who should work on that, right? I mean, like OPNFV
Yeah.
embarked on this journey a couple years ago.
I mean, OPNV have the Fast Data Stacks project, which does a lot of this integration and includes different controllers
Yeah.
and different data planes and so on for exactly that reason. And that's
But
probably
it's kind of just building them. It's not actually
well, they're working on integrating them so they actually work.
like use them. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the integration just from the building perspective
But just to
is a good
follow
idea.
on, I think we all agree that there isn't going to be a single giant controller in London that manages the world, right? But that we need a federation of controllers, both east-west and north-south, and there are not enough good protocols that have been implemented to allow controllers to exchange state and intent about what is happening.
But
right?
it's some of that because we're not yet in a position where we can adequately define what that data looks like
I
in
think
a way
it's a
that
use
can.
case problem, I
Yeah.
agree. And maybe the MEF will start to be a place where we can start to come in, don't laugh, they are working on some of this, to allow us to start to say, well, what state do we need to exchange? In order for two service providers to
Yeah.
agree, I want Ethernet from you, you want Ethernet from me, how do I communicate that?
I mean, in the past, this has been easy. We all use BGP for everything.
Right.
But that's what I'm getting at, right? I mean, it's beyond the sort of build. I'm talking about the operation stuff. So that's exactly what I was talking about, like the exchange of state and things. That is not really, in my experience, is not worked on other than operators or customers have to do it, or they've got to pay somebody like Doug to do it.
Yep.
Or they try to chase their distro vendor to do it, and
Yeah.
it's tough, because it's if you don't like it from a distro vendor perspective, distro vendor is not necessarily motivated to test everybody else's stuff, right? Because I'm not selling that other stuff to you, right? And so there's got to be a better way to do that, right?
That's why the community is so valuable, because it's a meet me point, and we can do this with plug fests for adapters as well as controllers. It says, look, we ought to be able to say, look, if you're certified to work with ODL Carbon, then as a service provider, you get invited to the table. If you're not certified, then I know it's going to cost me, 3 bodies for 6 months to go through the integration and the test, and you're not a preferred vendor anymore, right? So I think we need to figure out how the community can help service providers, tackle these problems.
Now I'm
You
good.
look like you got something.
I had
for it.
something, but I mean, we are, and to answer your question, like who should be doing it, I don't know. I mean, we are, obviously, as a provider of services, this is something
maybe that is
we
the
are
other
working on. I
answer,
mean,
right?
we create our own software project. You guys can, little plug when it comes to our booth. We'll be happy to demo it for you. But, why didn't we go into, OpenFV or some other group? It just, we need to do something a little bit faster.
A little bit immediately.
And
yeah.
a little bit more immediate, and so we decided to kind of build that ourselves. It's been years. We've been working on it for 2 years already.
I mean,
It's not
is
quite
anybody
even
else in
there.
here from an integrator, VAR kind of thing that wants to, comment like that? Because my experience is what I was saying. I mean, it's either those guys or, Brian and those guys end up stuck with the baton, right? I mean, you all having that same kind of experience, doing the integration piece? Because it's clearly important to get all this stuff together, working together, right? No one, no. It's all great out there. All right. Cool. Let's shift around a little bit to something else. I mean, one of the questions I have on here is, are you happy with the way that Yang has been treated in the controller, right? Yang 1.1 versus 1.0, right? The decision to carry on with 1.0 for now, for example.
Maybe give some background for the audience what that means.
So there are two different versions of Yang 1.0, and then most recently the IETF ratified 1.1. Well, it's actually not an RFC yet, but it's very close. It's to the point where you can implement it, and some of the feedback in the Yang 1.1 spec was from us in ODL, which is good. But the current release supports 1.0, for example, and 1.1 is backwards compatible with 1.0 modules, but not vice versa. So there are issues with supported devices and things like that. I mean, is this an issue for you guys, operator folks?
I wouldn't say it's a burning issue yet, because everything we're doing is still against 1.0. But I think really what maybe the concern is, obviously there are benefits to going to 1.1. There's a bunch more. It enables you to express things a lot better that you can't do in 1.0. But if this is an all or nothing, where every module has to support it before we get there, in an open source project, that's almost like a dead end. That's not going to happen. So there's concern about whether we can get there from here.
Yeah, just to add on to it, I mean, we are fine with 1.0 right now. We have had one vendor who's come in with a netconf with a Yang 1.1 model. We don't know whether that's a flood about to happen. At the pace at which netconf changes happen, it's probably not a flood that's about to happen. But because of these unique capabilities where people are starting to run containers in VNFs, they want some of the capabilities that are 1.1. Right? The second thing is any XML for us, or any data, is a kind of a critical going forward leaf type that we want. Because as we move more and more into layer 4 through 7 config, where there isn't a lot of netconf and Yang capability, we're having to create these large data blocks that need to come in. And 1.1 might help us with that space, where we may have to do more custom things until we have support of, because you can do the same thing with just a really long string. And now you build your own parser and all this good stuff. It would be really nice if we had a Yang 1.1.
So that's actually a good point about the customization stuff, right? I mean, the NAXML is one of those vectors where you can stretch the module that you have, right?
And it gives you the advantage of the validation that the layer is giving you. It's like saying, is this valid XML in this payload?
Yep. Cool. Which we lose. So the sort of net is it's maybe not critical right now to go to 1.1, but
it will have to be a coexistence. I need to be able to support all my current 1.0 data and add branches, containers that will be 1.1 based. I can't have an OR switch. It will not work.
And be able to talk to devices that are 1.1 and giving you a 1.1 schema when you ask for it.
Yep.
so eventually we'll have, when we do support 1.1, we should be able to mount devices 1.1, 1.0.
Yep.
Maybe even the same device with both, right? same device may support both.
But
Like you're saying, in a container that's running on the device.
it's hard to
or-
say no to a feature because it's like it's a shiny wish list. You know, I want everything.
Yeah,
but
but that dual mounting worries me about.
Yeah,
It's
I-
kind of, you can imagine you write to one and then read from the other and the data's not there, so you write it again.
Right.
It's just,
So if you could probably constrain it to say any single device would be 1.0 or 1.1. I think that would be something
Okay.
we could work with.
fair.
Okay. Look like you got something to say. No? Samir? No?
Same thing, we are, as Chris mentioned, we are currently happy with 1.0 because that's what we have used to build our application on top of it, but certainly those concerns are valid.
Cool. Let's switch gears a little bit again. Or any feedback from you guys? Audience, no? Margaret, you're awfully quiet. You have a point?
Yeah, I just, on this topic of netcom gang, how much of your time is spent making sure that the network elements are in compliance with the data models and things like that?
So how much effort do you all
Beyond
spend?
that.
Yeah, you can't turn it on fast enough.
Can't turn it on fast enough. You
Yeah,
guys-
go ahead. Yeah, go
I
ahead.
start with the assumption it's not compliant. Just go from there and feel blessed when you come across something that works.
I mean, that's from wildly popular equipment too. That's not
Absolutely.
some
I mean,
stuff from the surplus
yeah,
shop, right?
Exactly. This is not, Snake Oil Co. devices.
Mainstream
No, yeah.
boxes, right?
So let me lead on to that because I think you're absolutely right in terms of the way you should approach it. We have the full spectrum. Matthew might be a good one to talk to as well. Matthew LeMay, he's seeing the same thing. There are some devices from popular vendors that work great, full compliance, get schema, every Yang model compiles and they work. Okay, and then
Stop smiling, Tom.
it might have been a device that he's associated with, okay? And then there's a
There are
set
other
of
ones that
devices
don't
that
even do
are
get schema, right?
close, minor things, and you can tune around it, and the vendor said, yeah, I made a mistake, let me get you a new build, that kind of stuff. And then at the other end of the spectrum, very far down the hall, is the devices that don't advertise the right node capabilities. You have to sideload their models, you have to hand tweak their Yang models because they don't compile, or they give Yang tools compile errors.
Well, you
and-
mentioned the sub-layer 3 devices.
So,
Those are,
yeah. So that,
You also have devices that don't do Yang at all.
and
Yeah.
ones that don't do Yang, they say they support netconf but not Yang, and so it's transactional oriented CLI. So if you have
Or you
ever
build your
s-
own model.
You build your own model. You build your own. Either you build your own model, or you say, punt. I'm going to just use my CLI config adapters, of which all service providers, have versions. In Java, in expect, in probably C++. If you go back far enough. No, we make it a carrier-specific module inside ODL. So if you do a carafe feature list, you see, our configuration component, and you guys probably have something similar.
But to highlight
so it's a
this,
southbound plugin that is basically a translator between CLI and MDCell.
just to highlight how a mixed bag this is, there's one major vendor which bought configuration automation software company a couple of years ago. And that company was instrumental in some of the definitions of Yang and netconf over the last 10, 15 years.
Yep.
So in the thick of it, that vendor that bought them still has not moved over to using netconf Yang for configuring its devices with that piece of software.
Yeah.
So what's the distribution of southbound interfaces? Netcom.
What do you mean? Who they get them from, or?
No, just like, yeah, on the platform that, for the southbound interfaces that you've had to implement, what would you say the distribution is of, okay, I've done netconf Yang, I've done netconf, or I've done CLI, or OpenFlow, or,
So we haven't done any OpenFlow in the projects I'm involved in.
Zip.
That's a access forward-looking thing for us.
And likewise, we're not really looking at OpenFlow as a serious contender for any major part of the network.
Doug might be.
Sure. Oh, 2 mics.
That's not an OpenFlow thing, but like.
Yeah, no. I would say we haven't done much OpenFlow recently. We definitely did a bunch, maybe in the last few quarters. But for us, it's CLI. It's CLI. I mean, is to say we have our own software orchestration platform, and although the user can't see what's going on, it's CLI in the background. If we're lucky, we have some netconf or some XML parsing we can do. If it's a rainbow cat unicorn, we have some Yang we can play with, but that hasn't been our experience so far.
So we have, like everybody in the service provider, we use the BGP module, both as a speaker and as a listener. We actually do some PCEP. We use netconf and Yang where that works. That's our first choice. That's what we want. And for big vendors, we're able to get close to that, and it works. For other things and either legacy PNF and other kind of equipment, we have CLI adapters. In fact, some CLI adapters are very fancier. They have XSLT template translation, all that good stuff. Sometimes we talk to what we call a smart adapt, that it's almost like an EMS, right? Those kinds of things. We also do REST southbound when we need to do that. We do a lot of REST east-west, talk to OSSs and that kind of stuff. We do no netconf east-west, which I guess kind of makes sense. But I periodically, as project comes up, I'm always looking at the OpenDaylight project list. What's new? What's going on in the IoT set of southbound protocols?
The ever-growing project list.
Yeah, the ever-growing project list, but they're usually solving a use case, and so then I'm looking as to whether that protocol is something that we will need in the network, and so does it work? Is it cluster aware? All those kind of stuff. I don't use the packet cable one that you guys use.
Or that he uses.
Or that he uses.
So in a brownfield environment, you try to move towards netconf things and get your vendors to start implementing as you upgrade it.
Yes, all of our RFPs, RFIs, the VNF guidelines from AT&T, netconf Yang is our preferred protocol of choice for layer 2 and layer 3 devices. The Open ROADM project is netconf and Yang based. Those are Yang service network and device models that are in Open ROADM. At layer 4 through 7, we've asked for netconf Yang. It's just not in their DNA. That's where you're going to see things more like Ansible playbooks, Chef, the higher level CLI-like, but with transactions kind of thing. We're encouraging them because the transactions is half the battle. The modeling is the other half. If you go to CLI, you're writing your own parser for the data that's coming back. And if you had netconf and Yang, it's automatically parsed. It's a data structure you can now use an API into. And that's what you give up when you get rid of Yang or the model approach.
Well, and even if you're using this sort of Ansible Puppet Chef model, I mean, there's two phases, right? There's mount and boot and initial config, and then there's post facto config, right? Which those other tools maybe not awesome for. netconf and Yang is specifically
But if
for
you
that.
remember Chris's list of API calls, functions, the Lego block points, right? Those are things that, things like Ansible, Chef, Puppet, pick whatever you like. As long as you have one of those, we want to be able to trigger those APIs on the VNFs, and you can't today, right? In a lot of cases, you've got a secure shell in and run it as a command line, and you're into ugliness, right?
So as a system administrator, I'm trying to put together a lab so I can just play around with this. What platform do you guys recommend? Virtualization, hypervisor, operating system? What's a good way to set up
We have all different kinds. I prefer Ubuntu KVM, right? There's a lot of people that would prefer CentOS, Red Hat, and we operate actually all kinds. We run on VMware, but we have not really seen too much of a difference between the hypervisors and the guest OSs, in all honesty. Yeah. We only run OpenDaylight in a hypervisor. We're probably giving up on some performance because we don't run bare metal. Yeah. But that's just everything we can do. But our standard developer desktop is KVM with Ubuntu guest OS, and then that's what we do in production. Yep.
Cool. Go ahead.
So can you speak a little bit about control plane performance of OpenDaylight? I haven't explicitly heard any concerns about it, and I'm wondering if I missed the theme earlier.
Well, ask the question a little differently. Is anybody using it as a control plane? Right. That's kind of what you're asking, right?
I think of BGP as a control plane, but that may be, you know, a brownfield service provider view of the world, right? We don't use OpenFlow. There is a performance paper that talks about how many, you know, OpenFlow switches and messages per second, flows per second it supports. There's one on BGP in that same paper. We study that part. We asked for more testing on BGP, same on NetConf.
One of the key takeaways they had there was that the northbound you use to make those changes is more important than the southbound performance as well.
And one of the scaling things we want is we want MD-SAL to have, you know, higher performance, you know, on data tree, change notification in particular. You know, we've got to make that faster, elastically scalable, et cetera. And these are hard problems. These are very hard problems.
Yeah.
But that's, it's not been a limit for us. But we're also taking, you know, we know what it does and we live in that design envelope, and as the community grows and enhances that software, we will move farther on that. Right?
Cool. Yeah, go ahead.
I guess for OpenFlow, you got to talk to NTT about that. Not AT&T.
Well, there are actually people using it. I mean, there are people using my distro with OpenFlow underneath. We have 2 deployments of BSC using that, but they're not what you think, right? They're not. Let's replace every control plane on every switch in the universe to do this. It's more like I've got 6 or 8 boxes. I'm going to augment their switching paths, like traffic engineering, right?
Yeah, it's very use case driven. I mean, we've seen a lot.
Very much.
We've seen a lot in the kind of the edge, almost like a firewall service, if you will. That's a really common one for us. You know, it's really easy to throw some OpenFlow rules and change that traffic. It's not quite traffic engineering. I would say it's more of a kind of a firewall edge type use case.
Yeah, it's probably fair for me to say, you know, that we're not using OpenFlow in production today, but we have it running in the labs. We're involved in other controller projects where OpenFlow is the only, you know, protocol being used at the access edge. You know, I agree with you. We see as an access classifier, not in a SFC sense, but in a service provider sense, that OpenFlow could play a strong role in that space. And particularly
Mobile
with
is another
P4
one.
and you know, all that stuff that's coming along, right?
Yeah, mobile access is another one.
Mobile access is
Yeah.
another one. Yeah.
So my question was around, not OpenFlow, but it was around telemetry. So how are you using telemetry inside of OpenDaylight? What are you doing with it? How are you looking at this? Because, you know, part of the issues when you're virtualizing is that you kind of lose track of things.
Yep.
And I wanted to have your thoughts on how you're thinking of incorporating telemetry in that, so you can take actionable loopback type of intelligent actions on your networks.
So in our space, we have 2 views of how telemetry should work. DCAE, if you go to the OpenEComp environment, DCAE is our collector. SNMP, VES, you know, a variety of different things. Where the controller is the primary network interface, it is the collector. So BGP link state, we are listening. We are the source of BGP link state back going up to DCAE. But we use that telemetry local for our internal, our smallest closed loop to make decisions on traffic engineering and that kind of stuff. So we think architecturally the controller, when it is the collector, can act upon that data immediately with the right engineering rules, but is also responsible for pushing it back up to higher layers in the stack so that they can get that abstracted view of telemetry.
So are you sharing that telemetry, for example, with your storage counterparts?
Yes.
So they can-
Well, with the DCAE that also handles storage. I'll say it that way, right? So we don't go peer to peer, we go to parent. And then the parent is the collection mechanism that looks at these, you know, middle and outer loops.
Our plan in this space, which we've not completed yet, is to have all elements in the network that can export data, devices, controllers, and so on, just dump that data into a Kafka bus, which is a common company-wide Kafka bus, so anybody can subscribe to that data, and then start building collection mechanisms the other side of that. It doesn't provide time series, but if you want to know what's going on now, it will become a focal point for where you get that information. The challenge is how do you curate that data to understand which is good data and which is terrible data. because not, I mean, as we were saying, support for various things is uneven within OpenDaylight itself, but it's also uneven across different vendors of equipment and so on. So they might be publishing something that looks like the same tree of data, but it might be empty. So it's identifying that and making sure that downstream consumers say, hey, there's all this data that you can use, but by the way, there's these huge black spots in all these places. And that's the management task that we have ahead of us.
Yeah.
So there's normalized data, but there's also curate data as well. So making sense of that data and all the useless information I don't need and
Basically, there's a full-time role for a group of people to look at which data is usable and flag that for other consumers to say that is usable.
Cool. All right, I think we're out of time. It's 11:40.
Really? Wow.
Boo.
Time flies. I want to thank our esteemed panelists today. Thanks for coming, guys. Your feedback is always welcome, and thank you all for coming today. Thanks a lot.
Cheers, everyone.